Okay, so now let's delve into the exposition, this opening part specifically. Okay, and one thing I do want to mention is that although we talk about this as sonata form and the model for sonata form, what's important to realize is that invariably composers will deviate in certain ways or will treat different parts of this in ways that may not be typical. You know, and so what we have in the model sonata form is sort of the typical example to which invariably no piece fits perfectly. Because every piece nearly will have some sort of sense of what is atypical about it. But understanding what makes a piece unique or what are the aspects of a piece that don't follow this model generally are the points that are interesting and important about that piece. So you got to understand sort of what is the expected model to compare what those deviations might be, if that makes sense. The reason I use Eine kleine Nachtmusik in the textbook is because it is the only piece that I have found, and I've looked at several at this point, that follows sonata form to the hilt without any sense of deviation, and I think there is no room for argument or debate. It just simply follows the model to a T. The other piece that comes close, but actually there is a moment you can get into a debate with some students, and we'll talk about that when we look at the terminative part, is that K333, Mozart sonata. It's a close second. Yeah. But invariably, every other piece I've looked at, and this makes it hard when you're trying to choose a piece for a final exam, because invariably I use both of those pieces as teaching pieces because there's so few to look at. Invariably on exam, I'm stuck giving a piece that's going to have some sort of quirky place that students may have some questions about because it doesn't seem to follow the model perfectly. So you got to understand there's some fluidity and not look for this in a rigid sense, but as a general sense. Okay, if that makes sense. Okay. So what I want to talk about first is this idea of the exposition. And as we look at pieces, in the textbook, what I compare is the K333 piano sonata to the Beethoven Waldstein sonata. And again, if this will work, I'm not going to do the musical examples on the video. So these would be something to go back and listen to. But let me talk to you about the structure you're going to find in those pieces and compare the important difference that begins to explain some of the magic of Beethoven and how he really is looking at expanding and reworking sonata form in new and interesting ways. My computer's moving slowly, okay. And this actually will begin the next textbook section, which will be in other words, the spring part 4 will start is where I'm starting with the lecture material right this second. And I'm pulling that up as quickly as I can. Okay, just so I get my numbers right. Okay, actually I take that back. The examples I use in the textbook actually are different. But that's okay. Let me use the examples I use in the textbook just so that you've got those to look at. Okay, so the example I use in the textbook as sort of again, the textbook example of sonata form is the Eine kleine Nachtmusik in this chapter. And what we find in the opening, this was the example I gave of double period in the previous lecture. So Eine kleine Nachtmusik begins with a double period. I'm going to get my phrase length right. It's 4/4, 4-bar phrase, a 6-bar phrase, and 2 4-bar phrases. Okay? And the cadence structure is this. Okay? And again, the reason this is a double period is that we have 4 phrases in which the strong cadence is withheld until the very end, and we then define these opening 2 as our antecedent pair of phrases, and these last 2 as our consequent pair of phrases. And the whole structure then is the double period. Okay? And then, at this moment, we have the elided perfect authentic cadence, and then a lengthy, I have to look up the exact amount, but a lengthy phrase that modulates, right, to the dominant, ending on a half cadence in the dominant key. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And so going back to our discussion of phrase function, phrases that don't modulate, present a tune basically, and exhibit periodic structure is what we call expository phrases. Phrases that modulate, right? Typified by passage work and scales and arpeggios, which is what this phrase of the monocline nocturne music does, is our definition of transitional phrasing, if that makes sense. Okay? The expository phrases at the beginning of the exposition are your section 1. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so when you're looking at a sonata and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I begin to figure out the different parts, it's no great mystery. Your expository phrases at the beginning are section 1. The first transitional phrase that begins to modulate is your transition. And the anacline nocturne usually demonstrates what is the prototypical way of doing this. Either a period or double period to start, followed by a single phrase that modulates, generally, not always, generally, to a half cadence in the new key. This kind of makes sense because the point of the transition is to set up now the next expository section, section 2. Does that make sense? So periodic phrasing in the new key, and to sort of create that moment of, and now we start section 2, this half cadence leaves you hanging and anticipating that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So this half cadence in the new key works especially well, and it's what we would expect to find at the end of the transition as a result. Okay? And so when you're doing sonata analysis, here's sort of the typical way that I tell students to handle this, the opening part, is if you're looking at a piece of music, even if you're not listening to it, if you're looking to a piece of music, this phrase is going to stick out. Can you figure out why? There's something about this phrase that's going to visually pop off the page in a way that this stuff doesn't.
Accidentals?
Accidentals, yeah. If it's going to modulate, it's got to have accidentals. Because again, in sonata form, we do not change key signatures. We leave the key signature through the whole piece, typically. I mean, that late romantic pieces might begin to change key signatures, but the classical norm is that you don't change the key signature, because the idea is we're reconciling this at the end. This piece is in the original key, even if we deviate in the middle. We are coming back, and so we don't change the key signature, if that makes sense. So this, invariably, there has to be some accidentals in here. Now, if you're modulating, you can think this through from the minor to the relative major. You may not need accidentals to do that modulation, so that could be sort of an exception. But again, you're going to see scale passages, you're going to see arpeggiations. There's going to visually, generally, be some sort of difference in look in the overall structure of this phrase compared to what you saw here.
Yeah.
And if it's a symphony, it can be dramatic. It might be all strings, and then all of a sudden the winds come in. It can be the strings here had the melody, and now all of a sudden they're just on 16th notes, while the melody now has shifted to the winds or some other instrument. So typically just looking at the score, this looks different than that, and then you see accidentals, and you're like, oh, well, that's it. That is the transition. So that's often what I tell students to look at first. Kind of scan and see if you can just visually find where the transition begins, because it shouldn't be that hard to find. Does that make sense? And then you know that preceded it should fall into periodic phrasing, right? So you're looking for cadence structures that would support periodic phrasing, if that makes sense. Okay? If it's not a half cadence in the new key, sometimes it will be perfect authentic in the new key. The idea being, if I start in G, as Anaconda music does, and I go to D, and this then is A, then, well, the perfect authentic cadence in D, we've arrived at the new key, perfect authentic cadence, and then we start. In my mind, the half cadence works better because it sort of sets up you know what I mean? Now we're going to follow in the new key. But perfect authentic can work, and there are times that composers will move to a perfect authentic cadence in the new key here instead of the half. But I would anticipate the half. I would look for the half. And if you don't find it, the perfect authentic cadence would sort of be the next option. Much rarer, Beethoven is one, and then there are occasionally the Haydn Mozart examples. Can be the phrase that actually there can be a real question of did it modulate or not, because the chord that we end up on is actually the 5 chords. So if we were, let's say we're in C, just make it easy for a second. In other words, I have this phrase that seems to sort of imply modulation, maybe, not strongly, and then we end on a G major chord here. Okay? The Beethoven G major piano sonata 49, opus 49 number 2, I believe. If it's not 49 number 2, it's 49 number 1. There's a G minor, G major piano sonatas of Beethoven, the opus 49. The G major one does this. There's some F sharps implying the modulation to G. Actually, no, I'm sorry, it's in G, so there's some C sharps implying the modulation to D. But it's relatively short, and there's kind of a sense, sometimes you can end on this, in that example would then be the D chord. And there's kind of a sense of, well, is it 5 in G or is it 1 in D? I haven't heard enough to really make a choice. The C sharp showed up late, if that makes sense, moving us towards the D chord. Is that kind of making some sense? And so there is kind of, students will debate. I mean, you can hold up hands and it'll be about half and half. Well, I heard it as a half cadence in G. Well, I heard it as perfect authentic in D. And no one's really wrong. It's just kind of ambiguous. And Beethoven, it's just how do you hear it? And Beethoven is exploiting that ambiguity because in the exposition, what he does is then follows in the key F5. So the D harmony now is 1 in our new key. In the recap, he uses the exact same, but it goes into G. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that can be a hard transition to analyze. Because you're like, we're supposed to modulate, and then it was supposed to be different over here, and it's not different, and why, and what's going on? And the answer is because actually you can be really, really clever and just end on the 5 chord, and from that moment go into the key of the dominant, or to the key of the tonic. And you can actually craft a transition that works in both purposes of the exposition and recap. That's pretty clever, if that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second, and then we're going to talk about dependent transition on the next video because I'm out of time.